Hello, everybody, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you here today for this great webinar. So we are here for this event called Road to Marrakesh. This webinar is in preparation for the World Bank meetings that are going to happen here in Marrakesh in October. And we are here today with this great set of great group of panelists, team panelists, to discuss a very important topic. We are trying to bring together two important SDGs, SDGs 2, Zero Hunger, and SDG 13, Climate Action. Agriculture nowadays, it's one of the industries that has been emitting a big amount of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, this is how we produce our food. And we actually have a huge tool in our hands, which is to make agriculture part of the solutions to our climate change issues. And then in this sense, we are going to have here today, a great esteemed panelist here to discuss about this topic. And I'm going to call them now. As a moderator, we have Dr. Klaus Liesinger, that is going to moderate the session today. We have Dr. Ratan Lal, we have Dr. Daniel Naun, we have Dr. Emilio Gonzalez, we have Dr. Job Kihara, Dr. Jan Shamizingori, and Dr. Daniel Magnon. I would like to thank you all the panelists and our moderator for being here with us today. And the idea is that we can bring not only the solutions, but showcase that we can, and we are already doing this, we can make agriculture part of the solutions and to make this aware for the greater audience, but also to the stakeholders that are going to be around here for October. So thank you very much. And then I give the floor to Professor Klaus. Thank you very much, Klaus. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leonardos. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I can promise you we are discussing a most important subject, and a subject I'm currently here at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and food security is high on the list. Obviously, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has talked about food security as a security issue. And we have, as you all know, we have much more knowledge than is actually implemented, and we have much more know-how than do-how, and this is something that that we change, first of all. Secondly, and I would be grateful, Leonardo, if you could put my slide on so that I can explain what I mean. Yes, the next one, please. Next one. Thank you. I know that you all know that we are dealing with a complex issue, and this is part of the explanation that we are making less progress than we would wish that we make. And I heard yesterday that Brazil is taking over the G21 now, no longer G20, after the exception of the African Union to the G20. The G21 will do a lot on local things, on social, political, institutional frameworks. From a Brazilian point of view, President Lula has a great seriosity and acceptance in this regard. Secondly, the small farmers, indigenous knowledge, the blending of indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge is going to be promoted by the G21, and the contextualization of knowledge. And why am I showing this slide? There is one possibility that we can show a short-term result on food security without destroying the planet by promoting climate change. And that has to do with soil health. It has to do with the subject that we are discussing here. And it's a great pleasure to do that. Can I have the next slide? Here in New York, it was halftime of the Sustainable Development Goals process, the Agenda 2030, and the sad result is that not a single country is where it ought to be on one of the 17 goals. Everybody is lagging behind. Guterres, the UN Secretary General, is already talking now on a booster after 2030, which kind of between the line is an acknowledgement that we are going to have a problem with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But we here can concentrate on zero hunger, on mitigation of insecurity of food, while doing something for the climate. And the combination of these two things is a most important most important act. Can I have the next slide, the last one? You know, we all know that if you look at the complexity of hunger, that a lot of the political institutional things take time. And we cannot tell the hungry people, we need the time for political reorganizations, we need the time for organizational changes. They want to eat today and tomorrow. So the question is, how can we achieve appropriate short-term results with regard to improving food security in harmony with the long-term objective of the Agenda 2030? Hopefully, what are the 3 to 5 essentials in this regard? And then how can we accelerate the implementation of what is known to be appropriate? And I understand that Shami is going to share some examples with us. So I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. And I want to start my questioning with Professor Daniel Nahon, because the issue that I see here is that soils are a most important component of our quest to fight climate change and to feed the population. And yet, healthy soils have been left out of the discussion. What, Professor Nahon, is the reason? What is the explanation for that, and how can we overcome this?
Yeah, thank you, Klaus. Yes, it's very important. The IPCC was created in 1988, both from a political decision and from an initiative of meteorologists who consider that the climate and its evolution depended only on the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere. The land use mentioned in Jules Charney's report was minimized or even forgotten. I think that IPCC's error is not to have considered the importance of land use from the outset and not to evaluate it today at its fair value. I would just like to take a few examples. The role of forests is not simply played in the action of photosynthesis, as climatologists consider in the assessment of CO2 cycle. During a glaciation, the extent of forest is reduced considerably even in tropical regions where they remain in galleries and in the north where tundras expand. Fewer trees absorb less CO2. The atmosphere should be richer in CO2, but it is the opposite that we observe. The atmosphere contains 30% less CO2. Why? Quite simply because the bacterial life of the soil is much less active due to the drop in temperatures and the drop in rains. It is therefore the bacterial life of the soil which controls the CO2 balance. Living soils were poorly taken into account by IPCC during decades. Today, deforestation continues at high speed over the world. Even the boreal forests have been affected. Burning forests and domestic wood fires produce soot particles, nanoparticles of black carbon, which tend to warm the atmosphere significantly on a global scale, a little less than CO2. Another little known aspect of forests is the weathering of rocks. The weathering flux is about 10 times higher under forested land than under bared soils. Silicated rock weathering consumes atmospheric carbon dioxide. Deforestation means, therefore, eliminating its atmospheric CO2 uptake. Land irrigation was also poorly evaluated. The consequence today of irrigation of crops is an evaporation of 1,000 cubic kilometers of water per year. It is a positive feedback which increases the warming by a factor of 3. Bioenergy may contribute less to climate change mitigation than assumed previously. It's quite the opposite, the desired goal. These are just few examples, but I have a lot of other examples for the next time. Thank you very much, Klaus.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I can just add here, in yesterday's meeting, climatologists, climate experts said that things are much worse and are faster accelerating than the current statistics shows, and that the IPCC data show. And it's for political reasons that here one is keeping not all the data back. Anyway, if carbon sequestration is a possibility to make a positive contribution, Professor Vatanlal, how large is the soil carbon compartment? How can we rely? On soil carbon sequestration as a mitigation tool? Is this a real possibility? Please unmute your microphone. Please unmute your microphone. We don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's a very good question. I hope the sound system is good. I do hear some background disturbance. Your question about how much carbon in soil can help, the answer to that question is that the optimum range of soil organic matter content for high fertilizer use efficiency, high irrigation water conservation efficiency, for better root growth and development is somewhere for tropical soils between 2.5 to 3% organic matter content in the root zone. Most cultivated soils under traditional farming system, because of taking away the crop residue, because of the grazing of stubbles, because of losses by erosion, both wind and water, because of high decomposition rate caused by increase in temperatures and high temperature throughout the year in the tropical environment. The most soils, cropland soils of resource-poor farmers of the world throughout the tropics and subtropics is about 0.5%. In some soils of Indo-Gangetic plain, the soil organic matter content has been less than 0.25%. Therefore, improving soil organic carbon content over time, transformation from mulch to mulch farming from conventional system, growing cover crops, leguminous and others to increase organic. It's not going to happen over a annual scale. It's really going to happen over a decadal scale. So maybe a generation time scale that the soil organic carbon content can be improved. With that one, we can certainly increase the use efficiency, water conservation, productivity, every extra ton of carbon in soil can increase cereal yield somewhere between 70 to 100 kilogram per hectare. Yield of the legumes, beans, etc., probably between 20 to 30 kilogram per hectare. Most crop yield can be improved by increase in use efficiency. The question is, how can we motivate farmers, especially small landholders, resource poor farmers who do not have resources to leave the crop residue? And that motivation is through payment for ecosystem services. This is not a subsidy. This is not a handout. It's not a charity. It is, we are asking farmers to do something. And I think the price at present market should be somewhere between $150 to $200 per ton of carbon. That means about $50 per credit. That's $50 per ton of CO2. Therefore, if a farmer sequesters half a ton of carbon, they should get somewhere between $70 to $100 per hectare. If a farmer sequesters 1/3 of a ton, it is somewhere between $50 to $70 per hectare. So this is the motivation that is required. And to do that, I would recommend very strongly application, enactment of a Soil Health Act. In the US, for example, we have a Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, but you cannot expect to have a clean water, algal bloom, another issue that we are facing very seriously in many parts of the world, including the US, if the soils are not healthy. Therefore, Soil Health Act would be essential. And under the Soil Health Act, there should be a provision for payment to farmer for ecosystem services. I want to mention very briefly the why soils were not recognized before. If you look at the IPCC, the first group of soil scientists who are invited to join IPCC was in the year 2000, though IPCC began in 1988. Original people who are there are modeler, climatologists, global circulation model, and so forth, and foresters. Soil scientists were not recognized. Even when 4 per 1,000 has been implemented by COP21 in Paris, the number of countries actually adopting that goal, even 0.1%, is not happening as rapidly as we can, because the soils are still given a lip service, not really given the consideration they're due. The slogan, from my perspective, to nutrient soil fertility management should be CNPK, not NPK. If there's a C, mean adding carbon in soil, improving soil health, the use efficiency of fertilizer will improve and the productivity will increase. And that is the policy that we need nationally and globally. Thank you.
Professor Lal. Can I just ask Emilio Sanchez to answer the next question, which is, given your expertise with conservation agriculture, particularly in Europe, in the drier Mediterranean area, are we on a good track to combine SDGs 2 and 12? What will solutions look like?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lessinger. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Linking those two SDGs is essential. Coming from Europe, you might think that zero hunger is not the main problem for European citizens or farmers. But in fact, we are facing, after the last crisis, we are facing new situations where we must take even more care about how to deal with those two SDGs and how link them together, and how several initiatives have proven to perform in our conditions in the Mediterranean, that can be also applicable to Northern African and Southern African countries. But I would like to talk about a system like conservation agriculture based on 3 principles, which are minimum soil disturbance, that means no tillage, plus permanent soil cover, carbon for the soil, protection for the soil, and crop rotation and diversification to prevent pests, diseases, and weed infestations. So those 3 principles can be adapted throughout the world, and in fact, they are adapted in many countries. There are more than 220 million hectares of no-till in our world. And we must understand that soil is part of the solution to these 2 important SDGs. Healthy soils are an ally to fight against climate change. Healthy soils, as Professor Lal has mentioned, are essential to provide society with clean water. But studies from the European Commission alert that the soil degradation entail loss of ecosystem services, which are estimated around 32 billion euro per year only in the European Union. And erosion, which we know it's one of the causes of soil degradation, is costing European farmers almost 1.3 billion euro per year. So we are talking about how agriculture is suffering, and we should think how through conservation, regenerative agriculture is part of and can be part of the solution. I would like to deepen a little bit on that. And the European, I was last Tuesday and Wednesday in Brussels, and the members of the presidency of the European Union, which is Spain now, they admitted that soil has not been taken care as water and as air, and it should be in the future. And that's why it was expected by the end of this year. The European Commission is going to propose a new soil health law for Europe. So we strongly believe that is a time for conservation agriculture in Europe, is time for conservation agriculture in Africa.
Thank you very much, Emilio. That's good news that the European Union has made up its mind on that, and these days positive news are scarce, so let's celebrate this one. The next question is to Job Kihara. Job, in sub-Saharan Africa, where limitations are different, highly weathered soils, what is the situation now? What do we need in order to combine SDG 2 and SDG 13, and particularly with regard to sub-Saharan Africa? Mitigation of poverty will not be possible without a more productive and healthy agriculture. So it's also goal 1 that is involved here.
Thank you. In Africa, indeed, we have a completely different situation. This is an area with highly weathered soils that are very widespread, soils that are rich in important nutrients, soils with low cation exchange capacities, with challenges of calcium and magnesium, and even sometimes the ratios of these nutrients also affect the productivity. These are soils also that have different levels of acidity, and that also has implications in terms of the accessibility of specific nutrients to plants. So the complexity in Africa is challenged by very heterogeneous soils. As you move from one place to another, the situation actually changes. So under such environments, we need quite a different set of solutions that have in effect challenged farmers so far, so that the solutions that some farmers have practiced have frustrated them in terms of not getting what they were actually looking to get. The soils have not therefore been supplied sufficiently with the required nutrients, and have also over the years experienced another issue, which is about micronutrients mining. And this has brought in the challenge not only of hunger, as we call it, SDG 2, but also the hidden hunger, which has implications in terms of the productivity of the people in sub-Saharan Africa. These are some of the issues that need to be addressed as we move forward. There has been solutions that have been developed over the years, tested in different places. And of course, like has been said, conservation agriculture is here. Climate smart agricultural practices are also here with us. We have been working on what we call integrated soil fertility management, ISFM, that includes bringing together different aspects, bundling varieties, organic resource management, inorganic fertilizers, as well as specific local adaptations to address some of the limitations in the different places. But these have to be adapted to the different contexts that we find ourselves in, or farmers find themselves in. There are solutions to do with the crop diversification strategies that can help farmers as well, and integration of legumes in those systems. And these are important because they also not only help farmers to adapt to the changing weather patterns, but also to input soil organic matter into the system. And this is important also for building soil carbon, as we have said. And they also help in terms of building a biological nitrogen fixation, BNF, that can help to replace part of the inorganic nitrogen that should be coming from fertilizers. Now, what has been lacking broadly in these environments, and what I would recommend that we actually make investments moving forward, we have talked over the last many years about blankets in Africa, fertilizer blanket recommendations. These are recommendations that cut across wide geographies, and refining those is very important to improve the use efficiency of the nutrients. Farmers fail to apply fertilizers or some of the management practices because profitability has remained an issue over many years. And investment to refine fertilizer recommendations is actually paying in the few geographies where some of this work has been implemented. Through refined fertilizer recommendations, coupled with climate information, farmers are able to improve productivity from the current levels to probably 20, even 30%. Bundling also with some of the enablers that have made farmers not adopt practices, insurance and finance, are very important to unlock the adoption of the different practices in different places. Professor Al has talked about CNPK. And I want to also say that in the African context, we also need micronutrients. And I would advocate that as we move forward, and I have seen efforts coming along around micronutrients, that we actually integrate much more micronutrients, work around the recommendations for micronutrients in different places to increase the use efficiency of the current fertilizers, but also to increase the quality of the produce, or what we call agronomic biofortification.
Thank you
I'll stop
very
here.
much. Thank you very much, Job. Let me have a follow-up question. If soil needed fertilizer and farmers don't give it, is it a price issue?
I will probably respond to you by giving you an example. I visited a farmer a couple of years back, and we demonstrated them ISFM, Integrated Soil Fertility Management. And after 6 years, I revisited this farmer. What I found is that the farmer had actually worked through a financial system, which is a community safety net, a farmer group, where they rotate and get resources, and invested in manure and fertilizers for their farm. So these are the enablers that are required to actually unlock the adoption of some of these practices. We need to make sure that the solutions we are developing are actually context specific, and that's what we are working around, to make sure that we are integrating user needs and perspectives and their constraints in terms of bundling the solutions.
Thank you. That's the complexity that we were talking about initially. Shami, APNI inherited the 4R principle of nutrients. And what does it mean? What does the 4R principles mean? How important is it to help to produce more food while reducing emissions and improving soil health? Can you please deepen this?
Yes, thank you, very much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this very important discussion today. And my intervention builds on what has been said by the previous speakers. And I think we first need to underscore the essential role of nutrients, especially when we talk about fertilizers, because when we account for global food production, it is actually estimated that at least 50% of the crops that are produced are actually supported by fertilizers. So fertilizer is very fundamental to crop production, and this becomes even more important in the global south, where the soils have much limited nutrient supply potential, and the contribution of external inputs, especially fertilizers, becomes more important. But with this backdrop of the importance of nutrients and fertilizers in particular, we still have to face up to the big challenge that nutrient use efficiencies are still suboptimal globally, which is at about 40% of nitrogen and 16% of phosphorus. The nutrient stewardship therefore provides a fundamental science-based, practical and actionable and impact-oriented framework that enable sustainable plant nutrient management to make nutrient use to be more efficient and also more effective, because we have to pay attention not just to efficiency, but to the effectiveness of nutrients, especially in terms of making sure that we optimize the productivity of nutrients. So the 4R nutrient stewardship is based on very simple 4 fundamental principles of applying the right source of nutrients at the right rate, at the right time, and at the right place. In many situations when intensification was taking place, there tends to be overemphasis on rate, which in many cases focuses on nitrogen, which tends to then result in inefficient nutrient use and some of the unintended negative environmental consequences. But a critical look at source, making sure that we have the right balance of nutrients, but then also importantly making sure that the nutrients are applied at the right time and at the right place, constitute a holistic framework that, when applied and adapted to local conditions, provide the critical practices that are needed to make sure that we are using nutrients in a sustainable way. And the 4R nutrient stewardship then provides a framework that can then optimize productivity, but do it in an environmentally sustainable way, which has major implications on both climate change adaptation and mitigation as well. And we have reviewed data from global crop production systems, which actually show that both the targets for increased food production and environmental sustainability can actually be concurrently achieved when 4Rs are deployed, placing more emphasis in environmental sustainability by more efficient management of nutrients in intensive systems, but also in more extensive systems, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where balanced nutrient management combining with organic resources provides a key framework for not only improving yield, but also improving sustainability of soils. And the current evolving thinking of 4Rs have actually focused on some fundamental outcome areas that include recycling of nutrients, so that we are not just overemphasizing the input of nutrients, but also ensuring that we are optimizing the recycling of nutrients within systems, and then focusing on not just crop productivity, but as Job has indicated, the issue of the yield quality is also important. And then there are some other key elements of ensuring that we focus on climate smart fertilizers as well. That's another important point I wanted to highlight, that the 4R nutrient stewardship also encompasses the technology of fertilizers. So the emphasis on climate smart fertilizers that have a low environmental footprint, but also enhance the efficiency of fertilizers in the field is also fundamental. And this all contribute to social, economic, and environmental sustainability of agricultural crop production systems.
Thank you very much. We are good in time. This is why I want to have one additional question to you. Do you have a concrete example where you can say this has been done and that was the result?
Yeah, so I just wanted to also emphasize that the 4R nutrient stewardship is novel in the sense that it is it's supported by global scientific principles, but its application is adapted to context-specific and local environmental and soil fertility conditions. So over the last decade, APNI has been at the forefront of delivering solutions aligned with the 4R nutrient stewardship in Africa. And I just wanted to highlight two important examples where we have been working in Ghana, creating a multi-partnership framework for better understanding the limitations and the interventions that are needed to improve fertilizer availability and also reduce costs, which is a big factor limiting fertilizer use on the continent. But as farmers improve access to fertilizers, we've been also integrating 4Rs to improve fertilizer use and ensure that fertilizers is used more efficiently. And our program in Ghana has been supporting diagnosis of nutrient deficiencies to design and develop site-specific fertilizer recommendations. And the key missing element in Ghana was the micronutrients. And by adding zinc and boron, we could actually increase use by about 20% above the yields that are achievable with the current recommendations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And that is all coming from diagnostic trials with soil complementing the process as well. And we have been able to actually work with different fertilizer suppliers in Ghana to integrate micronutrients as a part of a 4R right source strategy. And we have seen wide-scale increases in crop yields and also 20% increase in zinc content of the grain produced, which is a big factor in improving dietary availability of zinc. And we've also been working in Ethiopia, which is a more intensive system where a very unique situation, fertilizer use, especially nitrogen, was much higher than optimal rates. And we've been actually working with farmers to target more economic rates of nitrogen use, which has been a major factor in improving nitrogen use efficiency and also the economic benefit of fertilizer investment in wheat production systems. Our program also then integrates training programs, which supports the dissemination of knowledge. And we have been able to develop a training curriculum on 4Rs that is geared towards adapting 4Rs by farmers. And we've been able to reach about 200,000 farmers directly in a 4-year program and impacting almost 1 million farmers indirectly, which is actually generating significant leap ahead in the intensification process of crop production systems in the pilot sites where we've been working.
Thank you so much, James. My problem is, I heard about this Ethiopian case study 3-4 years ago, and I said, publish it, have a student making a dissertation on it or whatever it is, because these are the good news that the world is waiting for. There is so much pessimism, there is so much fatalism, there is so much resignation, and there you have case studies which nobody knows. So please, put young people, intelligent people on such case studies and have them published so that we can create the optimism to encourage others to do similar things. Thank you so much, Jamie. Daniel Magnon, in your recent Nature publication, you assess sub-Saharan African food security futures through different socio-economic models. Why is phosphorus so important for sub-Saharan African food security?
Well, thank you for that question. I'll start by saying the main reason that we would be interested in phosphorus is because it's a finite resource. So unlike nitrogen that's coming from that comes from the atmosphere, phosphorus is mined from rock sources. And therefore, it's really important to think about this finite resource within a context of food security. If you think about areas of the world like Europe, like North America, over the 20th century, they put in huge amounts of phosphorus, amongst other nutrients, onto their soils. And that has been part of the contribution to the large yields that European soils produce. Sub-Saharan Africa, by contrast, has not had that history. And we've already heard a lot about how nutrients in sub-Saharan African soils are depleted. That's compounded by the natural features of the highly weathered soils. And so really, we need to think about how those nutrients play into a food secure future. And I think it's worth thinking at this point about what that we mean by food security. This panel is on food security and soil health, but it's the FAO calls it when all people at all times have physical, economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary requirements and food preferences. And so I think there's a huge amount to unpack there around the fact that it's not just being good enough, it is actually around choice, it's around health, and it's around all those wider contexts. And so with that in mind, we took a whole range of looks of different ways that the future might go to 2050 to look at how much phosphorus in particular will be used to get to something that looks like a food secure future for sub-Saharan African countries. Without going into too much detail, this was a modeling approach, and it basically said, well, if you need to grow crop A, and we put a range of crops into the model, it will require a certain amount of phosphorus and the soils will behave in a certain way. So there's a whole consideration there. And what we were really wanting to do is say, well, we don't know what the future looks like, but we do know broadly from our current politics what the future might look like. And these were known as the shared socioeconomic pathways. So really sort of fundamental these days to how we think about environmental futures. So that could be a fossil fueled future. It could be something that's much more sustainable, where we become much more efficient with our use of resources, we're more efficient with use of land. But it could also be something where we go to a more nationalistic future or a more unequal future. And broadly speaking, nationalistic and unequal futures tend to lead to worse food security outcomes for the general population, whilst sustainable futures, which use high technology and more efficient use of resources, and fossil fuel futures can improve food security. Now, of course, we need to think about that in the round, and we don't want to encourage a fossil fuel future. We want to be thinking about that pathway to sustainable growth. But I will just leave with one point, which is to say that our calculations were that it was about 440 million tons of phosphate rock would be required by 2050 just to sustain the current levels of sub-Saharan African food security. And that can sound like a lot, but when you put it into the context of the known reserves, actually that's a drop in the ocean. And so that leads us to a point where we're thinking it's not the geological resource that's going to prohibit us getting to a food secure future in sub-Saharan Africa. It's that wider context about everything we've been hearing from some of the previous speakers around the economics of it, the financing of it, the logistics of it, education, farmer attitudes, all of those wider socio-economic perspectives that will really influence how we use phosphorus and whether it leads to a food secure future.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This confirms my experience that I have in the health field, that you can talk about drugs and you can heal people by giving them drugs, but if you do not change the whole environment, you perpetuate the problem and you fight against symptoms. And what I understand from you, or my question to you would also be, what can we do from the north with regards to development cooperation to strengthen the educational services that go to the small farmers, because on the one hand they know a lot with regard to indigenous knowledge, and they need more with regard to scientific knowledge. And if that is not done through the extension services, nobody is going to do it, because I do not want 50,000 different NGOs bringing different approaches and then have a lot of pilot micro successes. What could we do? And I will ask in a moment also Emilio, what could the EU do? What can we do? We know what has to be done, and if it is a resource issue, there is a possibility of transfer and of education. And Daniel, what would be the role of extension services, and what would be the role to support them?
Well, I think when you're tackling any challenge on this scale, it has to be both a bottom-up and a top-down approach. I think there's an important aspect of not thinking that Western science knows best, but finding the space of how the knowledge that has been created in other parts of the world that have got to more food secure futures can also be utilized in different contexts. So I think it's a multi-sector approach that needs to happen, and that needs to include both farmers on the ground or farmers' representatives, and that needs to be an honest dialogue, because people can be rightly mistrustful of outsiders coming in and thinking they know best. But it's also about making sure all of those broader funding mechanisms, those infrastructure approaches are in place. So one of the features that I think we heard about earlier was around the profitability. So using fertilizers and leading to profitability. We can often talk about two types of yields, economic yields and ecological yields, one being how much profit you make, the other being how much crop you grow. You could have the highest ecological yield in the world, but if the roads are rubbish to get out of that area and it costs a fortune to get your crop out, you're not going to make a profit on it. So it's that round package of listening to people in the local area to understand what they need, and where there's resource to put into it, making sure that local knowledge is informing that in conjunction with wider scientific policies or wider scientific knowledge.
Thank you very much. Very important answer. Emilio, given your experience as an expert of the European Commission and the FAO, what are the main challenges for Europe to combine food security while ensuring climate positivity? What can we learn and what to avoid? Because experience does not have to be repeated if it is a negative experience.
You're right. Negative experiences are everywhere, unfortunately. My advice, not only to Europe but also to Africa, would be to bring science close to policymakers. I'm going to give you an example. Over 15 years, we transformed the university farm from a tillage-based farm to conservation agriculture. I must say the rector is very happy because the results are amazing. I mean, we've increased productivity in rain-fed conditions over 20-25% in most of the crops. We are reducing and cutting costs, especially fuel, by more than half, just fuel. And we have increased soil organic carbon, organic matter, and that's because of good agricultural practices. Thinking on the 3 dimensions of sustainability, sometimes in Europe and in other regions, policymakers just cling to probably the environmental, in other places to the economic, in some other places take into account too, but we should think on the 3 dimensions, the economic, environmental, and social. So I would strongly suggest bring policymakers to the field, and we did that. Let me tell you, I have a very good example from the Spanish government. Kind of 8 years ago, high-level people from the ministry came to a conservation agriculture field day. They spent 5 hours with surrounded by 1,000 farmers, talking about soil, so talking about machinery, sustainable machinery, which is also a big issue, the sustainable mechanization of the countries, and including, of course, all the economic side and what the farmer needs. So after that, we've been working close to the policymakers, and last year the government within the new common agriculture policy established a framework for conservation agriculture for both annual crops and perennial crops, and farmers will be offered a set of in fact they are offered a set of practices of that they can receive funds from the government because of the ecosystem services, and the key role they are playing in terms of environment protection and good practices. So that's it. I think we need to work closely and trying also what you mentioned before, Klaus, to make the good examples known among the community.
I was for some time with CIMMYT, in the board of CIMMYT, and I always tried to bring top politicians to CIMMYT, not the functionaries who determine how much money are we going to give next year. Just to show that if you do the right thing, you get the results you want. And you have to repeat that, because there are new politicians coming in, and there are a lot of ideological people amongst the politicians, and without going in too much details, but they also, if they bring them to the practical field, if they make them listen to the farmer and his or her experience, that has an impact on the thinking. We still have to be aware, and this is why I like so much your embedded approach, Daniel. There are political interests in the North that are different from the political interests in the South. We ought to be explicit about that. We should talk about values, we should talk about fairness, and we should talk about the hidden costs that we discussed here. When Job a moment ago talked about stunting, the hidden hunger has an impact on the productivity of the next generation. And this is an immense cost, because it takes away potential brain power to solve local problems. And if you neglect these kinds of things and then wonder that you have a lot of migration, which we are not going to be able to handle in a humanistic way, then that's the result that we have. Job, Kihara, sub-Saharan African soils are amongst the oldest and the poorest soils on Earth, very different from the richer soils in the Northern Hemisphere. How important is integrated soil fertility management and site-specific nutrient management to improve yields and carbon sequestration in sub-Saharan Africa? And also, if you have an example, please give the example and not just the theory.
Yeah, thanks. I think we already said, about these soils and being highly weathered soils and some of the challenges that these soils are facing. And you are now asking about some of the ways that we need to address these soils. I want to probably go back to where I started. These soils are very heterogeneous. The production landscapes in Sub-Saharan Africa are themselves very heterogeneous, and we need to address them as such. And what we need moving forward is to make sure that we have the right information that can help us to target solutions. I'm going a little bit away because I talked already about the ISFM, and I want to provide, how some of these technologies and targeting can move forward. We have worked in this space for many years, many partners. We have not been very, very well coordinated. Data have remained scattered, and we have had struggles to actually make the right recommendations at scale. And what is required now is to bring these data sets together. We have what we call the Excellency in Agronomy initiative of the 1CGIAR that has brought together agronomists from across the CGIAR centers and working together to develop solutions and accelerate their delivery to the farmers. So one of the things that we need is to make sure that moving forward, we have a coordinated effort and we are sharing the data so that that data as we collect it is also publicly available as we move ahead, and it can be used to conduct analytics that inform different practices in different places. So this is my call that we need to move fast in this space and bring together data sets as a coordinated agronomy team across the world, those working on soils, integrate climate information services, because that also helps us to provide advisories that are actually specific to the specific places. So this is important for ISFM, but also other overall management of soils and crops.
If you have specific experience that you want to share with your colleagues elsewhere, you do that normally through publications and through conferences. Is there a better way to do it? Should one develop a website where people can go to and find the coordinated results of all the research of all the institutions?
Yeah, thank you. I think that would be one way. Of course, working with publications, I think, is one way to communicate, but mostly to the scientific community. We need to do better. And we talked about a connection with the policy, those who are making policies. We probably have not done that very well in the past. And we need to improve to make sure that the research results that we generate are actually also disseminated. The similar effort we make on publication goes also into communicating this to the wider community. But also, as you say, developing central repositories where people can access, and especially translating the results into practical management recommendations. And then these are also made accessible to the farmers. We are working with what we call demand partners. These are people, organizations that have a broad network of reach of farmers. And these are then helping to disseminate information also through ICT systems, which is basically reaching a different segment of people altogether. So I think it's focusing on reaching the different stakeholders through different strategies and making sure that also information is available for people who may want to just do searches.
Thank you, Job. And here I want to refer to Daniel Magnon. We also have to make sure that what is known by agronomists, by soil scientists, is open to be known to sociologists, to economists, to development economists, because as long as people work in their silos, we will not really make progress. And I can only encourage to think about a website on where different faculties, so to say, can come in. Daniel, you talked about the importance of phosphorus for Africa and the need of 440 million tons of phosphate rock for Africa to take this middle of the road future, which would keep today's inadequate food security levels. Now, how much phosphorus is going to be needed to achieve food security in Africa? I was part of, or I looked at this phosphorus peak discussion, and I wondered how can one discuss phosphorus peak, because the reserves are a function of the price of the resource and of the technology available. And the more expensive a resource is, the more technological innovation will be used, and the more areas will be exploited that would not be cost effective with a lower price. So we are not in the next 50 to 100 years running into a phosphorus scarcity. But what would be how much phosphorus would be needed? Because the more we can quantify, at least in a corridor, the more we can also calculate and cost out, and that is an important decision element for development policy.
I would say actually only about 10% more than the figure that we calculated for the current levels of food security. So it will depend on a whole range of factors, but we're looking at somewhere in the range of 500 million tons. So only 10% higher than it's needed for the current levels, but it's about how you utilize that in an efficient way. In terms of this question around peak phosphorus, this is a debate that was very prevalent about 15 years ago, particularly because phosphorus prices spiked a lot, and that meant that nutrients were difficult to get to the farm gate across the world. So it went up, I can't remember what the rate was, but it went up enormously, tenfold possibly. Then there was a lot of interest in phosphorus, and the question was, how much do we still have? And there was a re-estimate done about 10 years ago after the peak phosphorus debate had started that said we have a lot more. But when we think about peak resources in the traditional sense, and it was started for oil as the first concept, we think about peaks in terms of their usage, and then they become not economically efficient, so the use starts to drop off, and we get a classic bell curve of something being used. In traditional settings, that matters because we transition to something different. So we went through peak wood burning that went through to peak coal burning, to peak oil burning, to peak gas, and now we're working towards other fuel sources in those sectors. Phosphorus is different because there is no known biochemical alternative, so we have to use that resource. But on the other hand, there are good estimates that suggest that European soils, which have been supersaturated with phosphates, would continue to produce not necessarily the current yields, but very high yields for centuries to come, with the amount of residual phosphorus that's the amount that's left in the soils after you've grown the plant and put too much phosphorus on for a very long time. So one of the ways I sometimes think about these problems is the phosphorus. There's an initial investment of it to put the stuff onto the land, and then you get the high yields from those different nutrients, and then you can move to a different form of agriculture. So it's thinking about it in almost stages of agricultural development. But of course, there's a wider context to that as well. What crops are you growing? What's your water efficiency? All of those wider challenges.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Professor Lal, despite being naturally poor and the old soils of the tropics, they are deep. And what's the potential of these soils for sequestration and for storage? What do we need to unleash this potential? Please unmute your microphone.
Thank you. Hear me now? Yes. I want to go back to what Emilio said, and then Daniel, and then come back to your question. And the reason I'm saying is, let's go back to Daniel. He talked about peak phosphorus, peak oil, peak mineral, peak whatever. Nobody talks about peak soil. That's a fact. And you just heard it. Now, go back to Emilio. He said 3 dimensions of sustainability are economic, environmental, and social. That is exactly what the Secretary General said in his Food Systems Summit report. And when I said to the Secretary General report, I was on the committee, I changed it to environment to soil and environment. It was never changed. It came back as environment. That is where the problem is. We pay lip service to soil. We don't employ it. We don't use it. We don't mean it. Even in this dialogue, we do not talk in a realistic sense. And that's a problem. Now, the other thing I want to mention in the same line, look at the 17th Sustainable Development Goal, and we are focusing on 2 and 13. Take the primary language, all the 17 goals, you will not see the word soil in any one of them. There's a land degradation neutrality in goal 15, but then land is not soil. Land is everything between the bedrock and the stratosphere. We do not use what we want to do it. We keep going around it. And the fertilizer used in Africa is 15 kilograms, 17 kilograms, maybe 20 at the most. Why it should not be 120? Why don't we have a program that says by 2030, we shall have fertilizer use at 50 kilograms. By 2050, we shall have it by 150 kilograms per hectare. Fertilizer efficiency alone is not good enough. Irrigation in Africa is 6% of cropland, compared with 40% in India, 40% in China. Putting fertilizer alone in semi-arid conditions, suffering from drought, is a liability because there is no water. So we got to combine that. Then traditional crops, sorghum, millet, cassava, yam, teff. We worry about wheat and rice and corn. We do not worry about this food staple. And unless we have a balanced nutrient, there is no way that even if the crop residue was put on the land, the C/N ratio of 100 is going to be converted because the P and S and other nutrients are also missing. So unless there is a complete system of crop residue combined with N, P, K, and S and some micronutrient, that residue will not become humus. And those are the difficulty we are facing in talking about things, but not really focusing what's the problem. The Green Revolution bypassed Africa because we ignored soil. CIMET and ERI, another CG system, were commodity oriented. And sorry, you are the DG of the chair of the board of CIMET. When IITA created soil program, the question came, but you don't show the breakthrough. Breakthrough comes from varieties. Here is the problem. And therefore, unless we accept that we do not address the problem is not going to go away. And unfortunately, simply talking does not help. We have a mindset, and those mindsets need to be changed.
Okay, Professor Lal, I cannot let you go in with such a pessimistic view. What can we do to change that?
Go to the policymakers and make sure they make policies which are pro-nature, pro-agriculture, and pro-farmers. And those policies should pay farmers for ecosystem services. I mentioned the right price, like $50 per credit. And that is not what private companies are saying, we'll give you $1 per credit. No, you are undervaluing. So the science is there. Translating science into action is a problem. That's where the policy comes in. And the policy has to be backed up by the money. And the money to pay farmer, nothing less than $50 per credit, otherwise it will not happen.
Okay.
Now, do we have the money? So we certainly do. World Bank has the money, UN has the money, FAO has the money, industry has the money. The question is, are they willing to pay it?
Okay, with that question, I'll let you go, because the financing of these Sustainable Development Goals is going to be the big issue for the next years. Yeah, Shami, you talked about this Ethiopian example and the Ghanaian example. What are the lessons learned for other countries. You know, they are things to be contextualized. They are things that are unique for the specific environment, whatever it is. But, you know, are there general lessons learned? And I will follow up on one. When I heard about this Ethiopian example, I learned that it was also beneficial, financially beneficial for the farmer. And the incentive, if we tell farmers to do something and we can show, and he or she will understand that's good for me because it gives me more money, then we need less moral suasion and less advertisement because it's good for them and this is why they want to do it. Now, what are the lessons learned? How can we make sure that farmers understand in a relative short term that doing what we know, the four R's and the fertilizer and the education, that this pays back for them? What can we do that this message gets around?
Very much, Klaus. Before I actually respond to your specific questions, I just want to present some positive news about the commitment now at the continental level to support fertilizer and soil health investment program. We have been working with the African Union over the last year to develop the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Action Plan, which is a 10-year framework that has been developed at the continental level, which will be ratified at the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit coming up in about a month and a half from now. And that spells out some of the targets, for example, tripling fertilizer use on the continent to enable both improved productivity, but also enable fertilizer to act as a catalyst for soil health improvements. So we are seeing some significant movements at the policy level, the continental level, to show a clear African position on Africa, on how fertilizer and soil health can be enhanced at the continent, and working together with multiple stakeholders from the development sector as well as from the private sector to create harmonized and coordinated effort, which should be able to make significant improvements in the current situation on the continent. Then coming specific to the question that you posed, I think there are fundamental lessons that we gained that have a lot of relevance for the continent. The first critical question is around the potential of smallholder agriculture on the continent. We currently have yield gaps in the order of 70% in large parts of the continent. And our work has shown that it's not just the improved germplasm, the improved crop varieties, where a lot of emphasis has gone, but the gains that can be achieved from nutrients are very fundamental. We are seeing tripling of yields when all other factors are constant, but with just 4 R's integrated in that framework. So that's a very big contribution that nutrients can make in improved crop productivity. And we have actually clearly demonstrated that by strengthening the science, but also importantly, the communication, especially with extension systems. One of the key limitations we currently face on the continent is that there's a lot of good knowledge available, but there is a big gap between what is available from science to what farmers practice. And a large part of that is an extension gap. So we can actually translate a large part of the yield gap to an extension gap. How do we actually ensure that we disseminate knowledge? And we're actually looking at different models. Traditional extension government programs don't always work right, but bringing in digital technologies for knowledge dissemination, but also working on locally based extension systems using integrating the youth into advisory services as well. And that's creating actually one of the investment that's needed to encourage youth participation in agriculture. And then I think the other key element that we learn from our system is not always single crop solutions that work. And the diversification of the systems is necessary to establish a more viable for our platform. So a good example in Ethiopia is the diversification of cereal-based systems with high-value cash crops like onion has been a key part of the framework, where improved profits from high-value crops provides incentives for farmers to actually invest in the cereal crops as well. So having a holistic system is an important part, that we don't have to always emphasize the food crops. And also, just to conclude, we understand a large part of investment that is to go into supporting farmers with technologies for sustainable plant nutrient management, but that has to happen in an enabling policy and market environment. So by engaging, especially the fertilizer industry, in developing relevant fertilizer solutions that ensure availability and more cost effectiveness of fertilizer, was a key element of enabling the impact that we have seen both in the case of Ghana and Ethiopia.
Thank you so much. Very good lesson learned. And Daniel Naron, in your recent policy paper published during the AU-EU summit last year, you brought healthy soils at the core of the green transition for Africa. Could you give us some high-level recommendations from this work? And can the solutions developed in the northern countries be applied to sub-Saharan Africa? Please unmute your microphone.
I'm sorry. Okay, it's good like that. Almost 70% of African population are one way or another associated with agriculture and rely on it for their livelihood. These are compelling reasons why improving soil health in Africa is the cornerstone for the greening of Africa. The water, food, energy nexus is central for the sustainable development of Africa's economy. I have recommended 4 strong actions among others. First, in order to leave no one behind, economic, social, and environmental development must come together. For this to be successful, 2 dimensions are of paramount importance in all activities: good governance and high ethical standards. This will ensure respect for human rights and the rule of law, transparency, and responsiveness. 2, in a continent where the population is likely to double by next 4 decades, one of the most important aspects is capacity building, both in terms of people and institutions. Youth will be the strength for Africa. They must be educated and trained accordingly. Education and gender equality are of the utmost importance. Third, no research, no innovation can be done today without the assent of the people. This is the reason why we propose that research and innovation take place in the lighthouses, African lighthouses, a new concept. They are concrete places from which will emerge both cutting-edge research and technical innovation adaptable to Africans' needs. In such lighthouses, we should find soil research centers, agriculture, biodiversity, water resources, green energy parks, big data centers, environmental health and nutrition centers, network of observatory stations, research laboratories on new ways of transportation to support the development of smart and green cities. The African lighthouses will be where farmers and practitioners must have the choice to tell what is most appropriate for their context and to be a participant as co-developers of technologies to ensure adoption. If farmers do not or cannot adopt it, all the investments will have no impact. Thanks to supercomputing facilities and to large research and operating instruments, these lighthouses will also be the place of establishment and exchange between innovative companies, green startups, and spin-offs. African lighthouses will be developed in situ by Africans to solve specific African problems, operating in networks that we are calling the Silicon Valley of the Green. Last but not the least, no green transition can really take place if we do not review the economic system, which itself is at the base of the degradation of natural and social wealth. The GDP is 90 years old. It is a measurement of social performance perfectly correlated with the development of fossil fuels. We must know the real price of food production. That is, we must give a cost to fresh water, to healthy soils, to biodiversity, to air quality, to forest, and include it in the calculation of the measurement of social performance as recommended for more than 10 years by the World Bank. That is. Okay.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You know, this kind of gives a summary of what I wanted to have done, but you did it in so much better way. It is important, and if I will not try to summarize what has been said, but the overall message is, for me, first of all, we know what ought to be done, and we have to mobilize the political will and the resources to get it done. First thing. Second thing, we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from each other if we share what we made as positive and as negative experience, because one learns from mistakes as much, if not more, than one learns from successes. The idea of Professor Lal, not only to talk about a peak soil, but also to think about how can one have a healthy soil act and develop things from there, is most valuable and ought to be something that we mention and bring in to the World Bank conference in midst of October. Very important, the results that Jamie was bringing forward, you know, and if and also Job, if the problem is that there are no resources to create an electronic platform where everybody who is willing to can find what he or she wants to find from different institutions and from different faculties. There is maybe a possibility coming out of this Global Phosphorus Institute that could build up such a clearinghouse, and you know, I want to follow up on that. Let me conclude with two things. The whole discussion today showed me that we need cooperation and we are in the middle of a confrontation. all the discussions here at the United Nations in the General Assembly were overshadowed by confrontation, be it Russia-Ukraine war, be it the fight for hegemony in the southern Chinese Sea, or the attitude of the American government with regard to some things. You know, and that brings me to the final word that Daniel mentioned, Daniel Nahon. You know, it has to do with good governance, and it has to do with good governance in the north as well as in the south. A lot of northern actors look to the south and say, good governance, don't do this, don't do that, while they are doing the same things themselves, and that's not a very credible approach. And high ethical standards, predominantly, you know, going away from what is good for me instead of what is good for all of us. Because in the long run, it's only good for me and my children if something that is done is good for all enough, because it is not possible to have a good life for a few rich people on an island of wealth in the midst of an ocean of poverty and migration. And thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you very much for the different arguments that you were bringing in. Thank you so much for taking the time and preparing what you have been prepared. And let's hope that what we have been discussed is going to find its way into the ears of decision makers and of financial people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.